Can I ask them one question and then we'll dive in?
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of curious. I learned so much from this film. First of all, thank you for making this film.
Thank you.
It's sobering and alarming and kind of depressing, but also kind of motivating, right? Okay, how many people have gone down a YouTube rabbit hole? Okay, almost everybody. Okay, here's the fun question. What is the longest time you've been gone down a YouTube rabbit hole? Anyone know? 3 hours? 6 hours. Okay, do I hear, it's like an auction, do I hear higher than 6 hours? Okay, 6 hours, that's an intense rabbit hole. Oh yes, of course, well that's totally understandable. Okay, thank you for that. So Alex, I left my questions up there. Would you mind just bringing down those papers? Thank you. But so you've made a number of films about technology and the disruptive nature of technology, about Napster, about Bitcoin, Smosh, who I didn't know about till I saw your film.
Yep.
So why, thank you so much, YouTube? Why YouTube? Why now?
Well, I mean, I'm an older fella, so I came up on online before the web in the 80s. I probably first got online in about 83, 84, which was dial-up. It was what was called the BBS era, Usenet era. It was all text-based. And what captivated me about the internet then was the community that existed already that was there was a very interesting group of people. And it's very similar to what we find on YouTube and in other communities online now, especially like Discord and sort of all the fractured off communities that you now find that where you can make your own server and kind of wall yourself into your own siloed community. It was much smaller. You had thousands of people, maybe 5, maybe 10,000 at most. But it was politics and art and pretty radical stuff, some dangerous stuff, some criminal stuff, some encrypted stuff. But it was community, and there was also a lot of outreach going on then. And this was the 80s. There was a lot of people, because you could be anonymous on the internet at that time. So you could find other people, or you could connect with people in different areas of whatever your issues or your challenges might be, the way a lot of people are finding community online now. But it was evident to me in those early days that this was going to completely change. It was the first time human beings in different parts of the world were in a kind of democratized space. And so my first documentary was about Napster, which interested me. Do you guys know what Napster is? Are you old enough? Not even, right? A little bit. Okay, Napster was thought of as, and I'll keep this short because we have a lot to talk about. It was thought of as a file sharing software. What Napster was 100 million simultaneous users on one central database for the first time in human history. It was the biggest, most disruptive global internet-based community that had ever existed up till that time by an order of magnitude. It kind of was like the YouTube of the late 90s, much more than what people think about Napster as now, which was a way to steal music, which was largely, don't get me started, it was largely propaganda that was being created by the record industry because they were terrified of Napster. But Napster was first and foremost a community. So YouTube is now by far the largest global community online on the planet, but now the numbers are crazy. Right now, I mean, Napster was 100 million simultaneous users during dial-up. Napster was the reason broadband internet was created. Broadband was created because universities and institutions were going down because they couldn't support the web traffic. And that's how broadband got pushed through. So YouTube is now, I think it's probably hosting 4.6 or to 8 billion video views a day. Right? And that makes TikTok is like that in comparison. Like almost all these other platforms that you guys are on are teeny weeny in comparison to that number. So that's why now. Like what are the social implications of a media platform that is bigger than any other media platform on the planet that isn't really a social media company as much as all of your news, all of your search, all of your film, your music, your television, all of your interconnectivity with your friends. Then you've got DIY. Then you've got influencers. Then there's some aspect of social media there, but not much. What is that animal, and what are the implications of that on the planet? That was sort of like the why now. And then when we started, as I said at the beginning, COVID erupted like a month after we started, and that really kind of gave us a guidepost for what the film was going to cover, because YouTube had such an impact on all of the events of 2020.
So, okay, and you guys, I'm going to ask a couple more questions, then we'll open it up, okay? And then we'll make it really interactive. So you've talked about the unrivaled scale. Why is it's incomprehensible. I can't wrap my head around the billions of users and views. So why is that a concern? Why is it important? Why is it a concern?
Because the influence of the type of content that is on YouTube is the other thing that YouTube has, which I didn't mention, is it's a repository for basically all of recorded human history. It's essentially our Library Alexandria. It is every conceivable piece of recorded media that has ever existed can be found on YouTube.
And I feel like we saw a lot of it.
And there's a lot of it in our film. Then the important piece of this is business, and not really algorithmic, which is YouTube is an ad-based platform, right? So its money is derived, and it makes a lot of money, is derived by the interaction of the user with the content and monetizing that content, and with ad revenue. So they are incentivized to keep you on platform regardless of the factual veracity of the content. In fact, it may make them more money to feed you non-facts. It may make them more money to feed you propaganda. In fact, that's being, coy, because it does make them more money to do those things. So that's why it matters, because they do an enormous amount of good, and we're on the platform all the time, and my kids are on it all the time, and I use it in my work all the time, and I like a lot of people at Google and at YouTube quite a bit, but it is inarguable that they are monetizing propaganda and causing real-world harm, just simply by virtue of the scale and the business model.
And then it's a monopoly.
Well, Google owns YouTube, and Google is a monopoly. Yeah. So there's no meaningful regulation. There's no guardrails. There's no litigation. There's a antitrust law being floated at Google right now that came up under the Trump era, believe it or not, in 2020, and is now making its way to the court. But that's mostly about antitrust to do with business competition. It doesn't really get into harm, which I think is what we need to dig into a little more.
So, okay, a couple more of my questions. So IndieWire headlined an interview with you, and it was titled, "How YouTube Caused the Hollywood Strikes." I can't help it. I'm a filmmaker. I have to ask that question. How?
Okay, well, I mean, they're being a little clickbaity, because I don't think I said that exactly. But the fact is that what the film is really about at the end of the day is kind of this inflection point we're at, where, the world that you all are about to march into, we've all faced challenges, like every generation faced challenges. We did too. But the challenge that you guys are going to face is coming into this kind of post-truth world, right, where it's harder to argue what is or isn't a fact at a very critical time in terms of what's going on with climate, in terms of what's going on with the rise of big tech and the monopoly power of big tech, and in terms of some of the harms that can be caused that are very real-world harms. So where that's showing itself right now is in labor, and I'm sure because some of you are journalists, and even if you're not, Hollywood is striking, but the Hollywood strike is just a tiny little piece of a much bigger labor crisis that's going on around the world right now. In fact, even our union has had solidarity. We have Teamsters who are in the film business, as you know, and we had solidarity with the Teamsters fight with UPS that was going to potentially strike. There are people at Starbucks trying to strike. There are people at Google who are trying to unionize and got fired, actually within the AI department just a couple of weeks ago.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. So this is a global labor crisis, and it's largely being prompted by the sort of rise of inequality due to the concentration of wealth amongst a handful of oligarchs. Many of those are tech oligarchs, and so there's a a problem that we face right now with the ability to fight those oligarchs in court and create meaningful anti-monopoly law or antitrust law or just basic safeguards and regulations, because they have enormous lobbying power and they have the ability to keep the government and citizens off their back and act with impunity. And they don't really care about the workforce so much. So it's this kind of Uberification of the workforce where everyone gets turned into a gig worker and you don't have benefits, you don't have health care, and you can't make a living wage. And that is directly related to the business model that most of the big tech companies have.
Okay, yeah, we're just coming out of what's the hot labor summer, right?
Yeah, well, and it's still, I mean, we're going into cool labor autumn.
Yeah.
So strike is not ending anytime soon. It probably won't end this year.
So before we segue into systemic, policy, and this is sponsored by the Center for Leadership and Communication Leadership and Policy, right?
Yeah.
So, but I have a personal question to ask. Is there a way to game the algorithm? Like the way they talk about the algorithm, it's like it's its own sentience, right?
Yeah. All right, I'm talking to, like, I enjoy talking to younger people because they're so much smarter about tech stuff than my generation is. But I don't think you need to game the algorithm anymore. I mean, I think maybe with TikTok's algorithm is a hot mess. And that's its own problem. And it's not what we made our film about. But it is a runaway train of chaos. And
Maybe that's more benign in a way.
Well, it's not benign. There's a lot of really terrible, like alt-right, hate-filled, nasty, anti-trans, crazy stuff going on TikTok. But it has a lot less people watching it than YouTube, and it monetizes in a very different way. But it's not to say that people shouldn't be dealing with TikTok as they should. But in terms of the recommended algorithm that caused so much trouble in the earlier part of the last decade, to be fair to YouTube, they did fix a lot of that. It is much harder. I don't know if you guys notice, it's a lot harder to get rabbit holed now in the same way that you could, say, 2-3 years ago, where you'd go on YouTube looking for, like, I don't know, an electric toothbrush, and then you'd be like, suddenly you'd be in neo-Nazi land.
Have you guys noticed that? I'm curious.
They've done a lot of work on the recommended algorithm.
Right.
However, all that content is still on platform, right? All the really harmful content is still there. And it is alluring, it's captivating, and it will hold you on platform. So the argument that I have now is that it's not really an issue of algorithm anymore. It's really an issue of business model. It's really a business issue. Like, I don't know, you guys in journalism, I'm sure, have studied the Pulitzer-Hearst fight of, I don't know, maybe you haven't. You should tell your teacher to talk to you about it. Of the late 1800s, which gave rise to the term yellow journalism, which referred to two huge publishing magnates that were sparring with each other over control of eyeballs. And the way that they did that was to pump out intentionally false global news stories in order to captivate viewers and make money. So they were intentionally monetizing propaganda in order to outpace each other financially, and gave rise to a term that basically means that your journalism is full of shit, right? For lack of a better way of putting it. That's what YouTube is.
So we've been here before.
We have been here before, and this has nothing to do with an algorithm. It's about making profit. And putting propaganda in front of a viewer is very alluring. And when you're doing it at 4.6 billion views a day, it's a lot of eyeballs and a lot of propaganda. And a lot of money, a lot of profit. So that's really the problem.
Okay, so if I always think we live in systems, right? Systems of oppression, systems of manipulation, and with social media. So I always think, I don't click on the ads, I'm safe. I'm gaming the algorithm. Clearly not. That's you're saying no.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one of the things I really appreciate about your film is that you showed us some of the positive, aspects of YouTube. People from marginalized communities finding each other, seeing yourself if you live in a remote area, right?
Yeah.
Dissident culture, right? So I guess as well as you highlight a lot of the negative effects. So I guess I'm wondering, is there a way to address the negative effects without harming or removing the positive effects?
I think so. Like, look, I wouldn't sit here and say that I have an ironclad solution for all of it because it's an extremely complicated issue. But there are solutions. There are myriad solutions, many of which YouTube knows perfectly well, but would harm their bottom line, so they don't want to implement them. But I would argue, and I think that we go to great pains to show this in the film. The film itself is kind of the story that you just asked, right? It is about a guy, Caleb, who goes down a rabbit hole back when those were more prominent, stays on platform, makes his way to Natalie Wynn and ContraPoints, and gets pulled out of this sort of downward spiral by this woman, this trans woman who he doesn't know at all, who is on YouTube with a really large audience, providing incredibly great content, if you like her stuff, which I do very much. A lot of the solution to the problems in these communities can be found in these communities. And that's why community has always been a driver for me and why I tell these stories, because they are communities. And I have a lot of problem with a kind of sort of satanic panic or reefer madness hysteria about the internet and like get your kids off the phones, like tell them to put their, like, sure, I get it. Like there can be too much. You can, there are harms there. You want to be able to monitor your use and all those things. But they are at the end of the day where they're the landscapes that we inhabit. And there's an enormous amount of benefit to those, especially what we just went through with COVID, where we literally lived on Discord. We lived on Zoom. That's where all of our interaction happened. So a lot of the time, the community, as Natalie says in the movie herself, she didn't expect the corporation to come and fix this stuff, right? She didn't expect them to get bailed out. So they just roll up their sleeves and they start helping each other. And so I think a lot of the solutions to the immediate harms can be found on platform.
Okay. All right. I have some other questions, but I do want to open it up and we'll kind of go back and forth with the interplay. You guys have questions about stuff we've been talking about and just questions that you had from the film? Don't be shy. Yes, in the back. Okay, hold on. There's a microphone coming. We're filming this.
Hi, I was just wondering about when you were talking about how the TikTok algorithm is kind of a mess. I was just wondering about the difference of that versus YouTube. Like if YouTube makes money off of how long you spend on that and like taking your data and things like that, how does that differ from how TikTok monetizes their creators?
It doesn't. I mean, the monetization is different in terms of how they do or don't pay creators. That's where there's a monetization difference. When I'm talking about the algorithm being wacko on TikTok, it's really mostly to do with the velocity, right? The amount of content you see and the amount of time that you see it. The business models are really similar. The idea of all these platforms are really similar, like including Facebook, right? They're all basically ad-based models, or they're based on holding you on platform as long as possible to content. And the TikTok content is very addictive. Like it is so fast, and so its algorithm is so good at giving you the next little dopamine hit. I'd say algorithmically, that's why I think this kind of stuff gets a little beyond algorithm. My point about TikTok's algorithm is it's just like, I mean, if you're on it, you're kind of like, oh my God, right? It's sort of a frenzy of stuff. That's just the way the UI itself works, and the way what the end user's expectation is in terms of their interrelationship with that platform. They know they're going to get super fast, super intense content and probably rifle through quite a bit. A lot of people on YouTube are using it like TV. They'll sit and watch one person for a half an hour. You know, it will be a little less of that continual rifling. I mean, it happens, but it's not as common just due to how long the videos are and how much sort of disparate content there is. So that's all I meant. I mean, from a money-making standpoint, they're very similar. YouTube is just way bigger, so it makes way more money.
So other questions before we go into systemic policies and such? Yes. Oh, hold on one sec. Sorry, wait for the microphone. Thank you.
I don't know if this is germane to this topic, but do you think there's a way to encourage YouTube to just have something instead of an ad every time between videos, put something every now and then that encourages empathy in a way that the old like Saturday morning shows, every now and then you'd see like a educational video.
There's a lot of thought in this area. It's a very good question. There's a lot of thought, and there's a lot of people working on that right now in a bunch of different areas, both within the company and influencers and other people who are driving new content to YouTube. And also, there are a lot of influencers like Natalie and other people who aren't like Natalie who are trying to counteract some of the negatives. I think that and I think all of those solutions are valuable and will have benefit for sure. So I wouldn't negate any of them. I think my fear right now is the monetized, concerted push towards harmful propaganda and sort of violent, inciting hate speech. So not just calling someone a name, but actually calling for their death, which is happening.
And doxing them with their address.
Well, I mean, specifically doxing an individual, but also calling out entire groups of people and demanding that they be killed on site or things like that, which has real world implications. But like I think what's going on with PragerU in Florida right now, where the government is mandating and allowing PragerU to be used in schools, which is a complete propaganda YouTube channel that is literally just fuels disinformation and anti-fact with a very specific political agenda that is very heavily funded. That has to get regulated at some point. There has to be law protecting kids from that kind of material.
So that is really intriguing what you're saying. Like it's like PSAs in a way. There's such a chilling quote. I forget the man's name who got unpilled.
Caleb.
Caleb.
Yeah.
So when he says, that it was killing his empathy and turning him into a sociopath.
Yeah.
So
well,
how
I
do we
mean,
counter
that's
that?
how you make an army of fascists, right? I mean, that's no different from, what the Nazis were doing. It's methodical. And unfortunately, YouTube is an unwitting aid in the dissemination of that and the building of those kinds of communities.
Unwitting or witting?
Well, unwitting to the degree that they don't share that value system, but they are profiting off of that content.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, well we'll take more questions, but let's get into systemically, what are our solutions? What kind of guardrails do you advocate for?
look, I think that there's a lot of similarity between the automobile and the laws around the automobile and the fight from the automotive companies and what's going on in big tech. And you can get into a lot of arguments with people. And look, I'm actually tech agnostic. I'm like more of a pro-tech person than an anti-tech person. So a lot of the crowd that I'm with are very pro-privacy, anti-surveillance, pro-citizens' rights, anti-too much sort of regulation that would actually kill the internet. I'm very concerned about laws that are being put forward in the EU and the UK and some here in the US that are aimed at fixing the internet or protecting kids, but will actually make kids much more vulnerable and make the LGBTQ community more vulnerable, make everybody who is vulnerable more vulnerable. So I have to caveat, like whenever I talk about regulation, with the fact that a lot of the regulation that's being floated right now is terrible and will actually make things worse for the average citizen and much more empowering for big tech. It will have the inverse effect of
Could you
what.
give us an example?
There's the online safety bill in the UK right now, which is being floated around, and the COSA bill, the sort of child safety bill that's being perpetually shot down and then revived here in the U.S. A lot of what's baked into those laws is de-anonymizing the end user. Forcing you to give your information, your driver's license, your birth certificate, your age, your name. You can imagine what that leads to. It gets into creating sort of standards for content that could easily be misused by bad actors. It puts a lot of information online that can get misused by hackers. And these things are already happening. So it's not like some kind of fear-mongering caveat to prevent laws from being put in place. They will be abused. and they will be abused by autocracies and far-right governments and people who will target the marginalized and the not so marginalized. Like what we're seeing with Musk on Twitter, you know, he went from, you know, attacking the trans community to just brazenly attacking the entire Jewish community within the space of a couple months. Like, you know, there's no end to that. And if you give that somebody like that an enormous amount of power and then the levers of control on law, it's very, very, very dangerous. So these things are not easy to legislate, but that doesn't mean that they're not legislatable. It just means that laws have to be crafted by people probably like you who actually understand how the internet works, which unfortunately in government is not a lot of who you're dealing with. They don't really understand the internet. They're just very angry, which I understand, and they want to do something, which I also understand. But but the point is you got to do the right thing. So I think long-term breaking up these companies so they're not so big, so anti-monopoly law that is targeted, laws that are targeted at accountability. We were talking about this earlier. This is what happened with the automotive industry. Eventually, they had to put seatbelts in cars. They really didn't want to do that, even though people were dying at a crazy rate. But eventually, they had to. They were just pressured so much by citizens and government that they put seatbelts in the damn cars. We need guardrails like that online. And you say that, and a lot of people get very angry and freaked out, but we do.
Okay. I'm curious, how many people in here think that YouTube needs any guardrails? Okay. How many people?
That's almost everyone.
Are there some
folks
in here that feel that we should not have guardrails? Okay, or no one that's brave enough to raise their hand. Okay, fair enough. So anti-monopoly. Okay, so here's another question. So I think I had a quote from you. So hold on one sec. Right, so that these platforms play on rage and anger and drama, and they build in profit incentives, right? So there are ways you could probably tamp with that, but like, what do we do about the human nature problem? You know, we're drawn to that, right? We can scale down the algorithm, but how do we deal with that?
I mean, the fact is that there's a lot of room for freedom and privacy and safety online. There's a lot of room for that and some law. There just is. It's a free-for-all right now. And the rise of sort of anti-democratic governments around the world is taking great advantage of the complete lack of basic standards and practices online. The COSA bill, the one I was just talking about here in the US that's supposedly going to protect kids, the far right is salivating for that to get passed. They've been very brazen about the fact that if that law passes, they will immediately use it to attack abortion rights advocates. They will immediately use it to censor any type of material online that helps people who are trying to get reproductive rights, women. They will immediately use it to target LGBTQ. I mean, that is like gravy for an autocratic government. And they're open about it because they're dealing with such kind of clumsy, thick-headed, misguided lawmaking on the one hand that no one's paying attention to them. So it's kind of disturbing. So I think that the human nature element is not going to change. The fact that we're fighting, 40-year-old reproductive right battles again, the fact that we're fighting 40, 50, 60-year-old civil rights battles again, when most of us my age didn't think we were going to be, tells you, unfortunately, that it isn't really that simple. Yeah. And that you don't get to stop fighting, right? Like, you have to get involved. The issue I have with my generation around the internet is that they have a very, largely, it's a generalization, a very patronizing, kind of dismissive attitude towards technology, where they're like, it's just bad, just tell your kids they can't use, they're on this stuff too much, we did just fine without Instagram. And it's like, that's not going to help anything, right? The reality is the inverse. The reality is like, technology is just an evolution of all of human thinking, the good, the bad, and in between. It's just kind of part of who we are. It isn't separate from who we are. it's really on kind of all of us to have some degree of involvement in terms of shaping how these communities work moving forward and what we will and won't allow. Just like it's on all of us to deal with climate change, just like it's on all of us to deal with like getting abortion rights back. Like it's on all of us to make these things happen, because we see what happens if we don't take action. These rights go away, our world becomes less safe.
Okay, I'm ready to sign up. Whatever you're doing, I'm ready to sign up. Okay, so we have public policy here, journalism people here, you know, from other disciplines. So I think let's segue into what can we do, right? So I think, you know, we've learned, like you said, we've learned you can't legislate human nature away. We can't legislate racism away. It doesn't work. Maybe it suppresses the expression of it, right? So so this is a center for communication policy, right? And leadership. So do you guys have questions or ideas about what communications folks can do? I know it's Monday night, but well, Alex, do you have ideas? Maybe you'll stimulate some ideas for them.
Look, the beginning is to understand how these systems work. The beginning is to keep your eye on what laws are being written and who's writing them, because they're all actually really, really, for the most part, good-hearted people that you can talk to. And so getting involved in everything from just like the most basic of just writing your rep or your congressman or talking to your professors or whoever, to actually working on policy or working on technology or working on journalism, or working on apps or making films or whatever your your little avenue of interest is. All of that is going to make a huge difference, because really awareness, like the thing that I do find somewhat reassuring, and we dealt with this a lot when we were working on the film, is there is such thing as truth, right? I don't want to offend anyone here who's a flat earther, but the earth isn't flat, right? It's a fact that it's not. So there's a starting point that you can aim yourself towards, and it's kind of a propaganda agenda to divide people between fact and non-fact, and to get people into a space where they're questioning everything without actually just doing the work of learning what the facts are. That's like the big, the parody of Joe Rogan, I think, these days now is like, he'll just make some grand claim and someone on his show will be like, well, is that true? He's like, well, I don't know, look it up. They'll look it up, and it's not true, right? Like 9 times out of 10, it's just complete nonsense. So, I mean, you can actually find facts, right? So I think that you can start with the truth, and you can question, someone who is aiming you at something that seems off. And I think that's actually fundamentally a really important thing. I think that countering the anti-science, anti-fact kind of propaganda machine that is really in full force right now. And I'll tell you, I mean, heading into 2024 election is going to be crazy town for the next 2 years. So it's really going to be an interesting test for a lot of you folks. And I'm sure, like, I've got a kid in middle school, he's 14, he's really smart. And when Andrew Tate got arrested, I went to him and I was like, and I'm around him enough to know he's not black pill, but I was like, what do you think about Andrew Tate? He's like, well, at first I thought maybe he was kind of cool, and I kind of quickly realized he was bad news, and now I realize he's actually like a terrible, violent criminal, right? I was like, okay, but what about your friends? He's like, well, I'd say probably 2/3 of my friends at school think he's cool. Oh. And I was like, even after the arrest, I was like, yeah, they don't believe it. They think the charges are not true. And, this is like regular school, right? And so that's what we're up against. And I think that you probably all have friends, or you've gone through it yourself. Like we've all gone through like our own sort of rabbit hole where we start to question and question and question. I've done it as a doc filmmaker. I've gone down like some really intense rabbit holes and then go, wait a minute, hold on a second. Like, where am I? Like, I've sort of left the reservation, right? Like, I've gone off into the la la land. I got to reel myself back. So it's not hard to have that happen to you. So I think we all have to be kind of grounded to facts as much as we can.
I think another aspect I think it's really important is media literacy. which is recognized, as a filmmaker, I make documentary films. So the idea that I can't trust what I'm seeing, it feels like an existential crisis for a filmmaker, for a country, for a culture.
And you will
For
be
democracy.
exploited. I mean, you will absolutely be exploited. There are people just waiting for you to jump on that bandwagon so that they can take you on their journey to where they want you to go. And that's what the internet is very good at doing. It's very good at weaponizing communities, which is what happened with Gamergate. Gamergate took a bunch of very kind of disenfranchised, mostly white, young males, and for the first time, it actually connected them with a very specific political agenda and created a little army that took us all the way to the Proud Boys and the insurrection of January 6th. So there is a consequence to that kind of indoctrination.
So how do we resist that? So you're talking about legislating. I think that there are ways for journalists and citizens to call our elected representatives, educate ourselves, watch these films. But how do we resist when we don't even know if what we're watching is true or not?
Because I do think that I would argue that we do have ways of determining what is true. Like if you watch PragerU, which presents itself as an educational tool, and they start talking about slavery, and they start talking about how the slaves were actually happy, and the slaves wanted to be slaves.
That's in the schools?
That's their anti-fact propaganda about white supremacy, which is what drives Prager, is white supremacy. It's a white supremacist institution, essentially. So, that's a non-fact, right? So I think that it's, I don't actually have the same total terror that some people do right now, that there's going to be no way to have attribution. There's going to be no way to know what is and isn't real. AI is going to be so good that you're not going to know, I mean, sure, you're going to get robocalled by your mom, maybe, and then realize it's not your mom. But most of that stuff is pretty easy to navigate. And I don't have the same level of fear there. But I do think it takes engagement and not passivity. I think that it does take saying, if I don't keep an eye on the world in which I live, the technology in which I live, the community online in which I operate, the companies that run those, the governments that are creating laws against them, if I'm not a little bit aware of that, it doesn't take a lot of work, a little bit of that, then we will end up in a much worse world.
Can you talk a little about your process in coming up with this idea and how it morphed over time? And did you have a preliminary thesis statement when you started in 2020? And did you have a red team saying that you had to pitch it to? And
yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, I'll keep it brief too. But the fun thing about making documentaries is that you really you should, in my opinion, start with a pretty blank page, right? Like, I don't know everything about the topic. If I did, I'd have no interest in it. So I usually start a documentary with awareness of my topic, but with very, very unsolvable questions that I want to get, either, if not answered, at least investigate and interrogate. And so with this, I certainly knew that YouTube had a massive foothold on the planet. I knew that I generally liked YouTube. I didn't come at it with a negative opinion coming in. I felt like they'd done a lot of good. I felt like they drove a lot of the diversity initiatives that ended up in Hollywood, had originated on YouTube. And intentionally, like they wanted to give voice to different people. But I started learning things pretty quickly, and they drove the direction of the story. I learned pretty early on that YouTube is kind of a front, and that it's presented as a separate company from Google, which is really the largest company on the planet, certainly the largest tech company on the planet in terms of its engagement with its populace. More people use Google products than anything else in terms of how they engage with it than an Apple product. YouTube is really Google's media front end. That's a pretty heavy thing when you're dealing with a giant tech monopoly that's profit is larger than the GDP of most countries, right? So that began to shape what our story was. That shaped the questions I was asking people. That shaped the questions I was asking Susan Wojcicki or Steve Chen or people who actually worked there. And then I started to really dig into some not so easy to find stats about YouTube's responsibility in terms of, I knew about Christchurch shooting. That was the big seminal terrible thing YouTube did that we all knew was YouTube's fault back in 2019.
Do you guys know what that is? Is anyone?
That was in the movie. It's the New Zealand. It's when 52 Muslim people were murdered in Christchurch, New Zealand, by a very terrible human being who wrote a manifesto basically talking about 2 to 3 YouTube influencers that had prompted him to commit this crime. Which, to YouTube's credit, they did deplatform Stefan Molyneux, but it was too late, and there were other killings that happened as a result of that type of content. But it became clear as I was in the middle of COVID how much of medical disinformation YouTube was driving that was killing a lot of people, and how much they were responsible ultimately, I would say largely, of all the tech companies, primarily responsible for the Jan 6 insurrection. So, which is the weaponizing of a community, against a bunch of innocent people. However, wherever you side politically, that's what happened, right? So, so those shaped our story and the direction that we went. And the film could have gone in a few different directions, but the way I tend to make movies, I don't ever make a film about YouTube going, we're going to tell the whole YouTube, it's impossible, right? I knew I would have to drill down. And so I seek a small ensemble of characters always in my docs. I don't like wall after wall after wall of talking heads, experts. I'd rather watch the news. So I usually seek out a very small collection of people who I care about and who I feel are interconnected and human and vulnerable and will express the heart of these issues. And that's what I sought. And they shaped the story, right? Because I'm talking to Natalie and I'm talking to Caleb, and they're in different sides of the world, and I realize oh, holy shit, Natalie saved this guy's life. And it's everybody's connected. And Carrie's connected to Andy Parker, who's connected to Caleb, who's connected to Brianna. It was an amazing kind of web that started to form from all these disparate people. And that drives the story. So that's kind of that's the organic flow of which the docs we make work. They're usually made with a small group of people, and that sort of, that and the circumstances end up dictating what road you go down. We don't have, Gail Ann Hurd, the really great producer, worked on the film, collaborated with us. She had brought the idea to me. But there was nobody who was sort of driving what direction we went and saying, you have to do this or you have to do that. So we were free. And I'm not disingenuous with my subject. So I told Susan what movie we were making, the CEO of YouTube. I mean, I have a lot of respect for her. So I was these are the questions I'm going to ask you. This is what we're making. It's not all positive, but it's not a takedown either. And you're just transparent. And then you get, as we talked about, you get truthful answers that actually convey a lot, even if they don't tell you everything.
Well put. Other questions? Or do we need to wrap up? We need to wrap up.
Okay.
Okay.
You guys are awesome. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, so stay aware. Thank you so much for making this film.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Thanks for coming out. Thanks to all of you. I appreciate you being here.
I really learned a lot from your films since I'm not a big YouTuber.
I hope you sleep well. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you both for the great conversation and the great movie. Thank you all for coming. You can stay up to date on CCLP events on our website. And I believe the YouTube Effect is streaming.
It is. Pretty much everywhere, including